Hello there, thrill seekers. I'm back home. So I thought I'd talk some more about home leaving. Good segue, right? So, as I mentioned, I'm getting married in just, I think it's 11 days from now, or 12 days. Anyway, it's really soon. And I mentioned this on the video channel, and a lot of people wanted to know about how a monk can be married. And I thought I would try to give you a little bit of the history on the stuff and explain my take on it. The thing is, this is a really difficult one to kind of parse out because the history is very complicated, and Japanese history especially is really complicated. I lived in Japan for 11 years, and I understood as much of it as I could, but their history is really complicated and really convoluted, so I'll do the best I can. So the first thing I want to start out with, though, is a little anecdote, because I wanted to say that the idea of married Buddhist monks is not universally accepted. It is mostly a Japanese thing. It started in Japan, and then since the Buddhism that came to the West was in a large part Japanese Buddhism, Japanese Zen Buddhism, that's why we have a lot of clerical marriage, as they say, married monks in Buddhism in the West. But it's not universally accepted, and the story I'm going to tell is this restaurant I used to go to, a little tiny hole in the wall, almost literally a hole in the wall. There was a wall with a hole in it, and there was a restaurant behind it. It was in this kind of a shopping mall called Nakano Sunshine Plaza, I think is what it was called, and it was on the, I think, second floor. Maybe it's still there if you want to go look for it. And it was a little vegetarian restaurant run by a Taiwanese woman. Now, I used to go there all the time, and it was one of these restaurants like they have in Japan often where there are not that many choices on the menu, and the main choice is called a higawari teishoku, which is changes every day. So according to the whim of the person running the restaurant, they decide what you're going to eat. Although in this place you had like 4 other choices if you didn't like the higawari teishoku. So I used to have conversations with this lady, but she was Taiwanese, and she didn't speak English. Her first language was Chinese. I didn't speak Chinese, and my first language was English, but we both spoke Japanese. She was better than me, but we'd have our conversations in Japanese. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself and tongue-tied. And so the conversations would always be a little bit funky, because neither of us were speaking our native languages. But I came in there one day just after I'd had my head shaved. I got my head shaved. Actually, it might have been the same day I got my head shaved, because I got my head shaved in a barbershop in the same little shopping mall. And that was for my ordination that I was going to do with Nishijima Roshi in Shizuoka in Tokei Temple. And she asked me why I got my head shaved, and I said, well, I'm becoming a monk, tomorrow or whenever the day was that I was scheduled to go out there. And this set her off, just got her really angry. And she just started going on and on about how Japanese Buddhism was corrupt. There were no real monks in Japan. If you're getting ordained in Japan, you're not a real monk, you're not a real Buddhist. And then she pulled out this notebook or like a scrapbook she had underneath the counter, which had all these pictures of Buddhist monks, Taiwanese Buddhist monks, working with really severely handicapped and disabled children and people and people in really seriously bad conditions. And she's showing this to me, saying, this is what real monks do, this is what real monks do. Getting really upset. And I just kind of said, okay. And I don't know, I squirmed my way out of the conversation and managed to have a meal anyway. But that was weird. So that is the kind of reaction that this often gets. So, let me give you a little bit of the background as I understand it. The best book I know of about this is called Neither Monk Nor Layman, Richard M. Jaffe. It has been years since I read this book, so what I'm now relying on is mostly some stuff I found on the internet, including a really, really detailed explanation of the Soto lineage's particular rules about marriage and meat eating, as it turns out, but we'll get to that. So anyway, I do recommend this book, but I have to say, it's been so long since I read it, I don't remember a thing in there, really, or just a couple of things. what happened was the Meiji Restoration. Now, if you ever saw the movie The Last Samurai, that is a movie about the Meiji Restoration, and that is when Japan had been a closed country for, I think, 300 years or something like that, a very long time, centuries. They wouldn't let anybody in or out of the country except for one port, I think it was Kobe. They would let Dutch traders come in and out of that, and that was it. But everything else was closed. So they were basically like North Korea, only they were like North Korea for centuries. And in the 1860s, 1868, our American Admiral Perry came in there with 3 big black ships and parked them in Yokohama Harbor and said, you guys are going to open to trade with the United States or else. The Japanese government realized they were way behind in technology and they didn't know what was going on in the West, and they'd seen other countries become dominated by Western European powers, and they didn't want that to happen to them, so they said, okay, we're going to open up to trade, and they embarked on this period of rapid modernization. And like I say, Last Samurai, although the actual, the plot of Last Samurai is fictionalized, there wasn't really a guy that was like Tom Cruise's character in there, but the history around it is really pretty spot on. And there actually were a couple of American people who went native in Japan in those days, but nothing like what Tom Cruise did. Anyhow, the point is, up until this time, the Japanese government had imposed a set of laws called Nikujiki Saitai. I have to go look at this. Nikujiki Saitai, which means meat-eating and matrimony laws. And these laws meant that the clergy, the Buddhist clergy, were required by law to follow, by state law, to follow the Buddhist precepts. And they, particularly meat-eating and matrimony, are the ones they single out, but all of the Buddhist precepts. And if they didn't, they could be prosecuted by law. And there were times in Japanese history where they could even face the death penalty for eating meat or having sex. Okay, this was a legal thing. This was not just a clerical thing, like it is mostly in the West, and how as far as I know, it has been throughout history in the West, where the church decides this, but it's not necessarily a matter of national law. This is a matter of national law. The problem was that Buddhism had this cushy relationship with the Tokugawa shogunate, who were the people who ruled Japan before the Meiji Restoration, or up until the Meiji Restoration. And they had made a lot of requirements for people to join temples and such like that made people very resentful. So when the Meiji Restoration started, one of the first things that happened was all this hostility towards Buddhism got let loose, got unleashed, and there were the Haibutsu Kishaku laws. I pronounced it wrong when I did the earlier video, so I'm sticking this in here. Now back to me, which is abolish Buddhism and destroy Shakyamuni. And that's literally what it means. And this was a movement to get rid of Buddhism. There were riots, temples were destroyed, all sorts of things happened. An estimated... The Wikipedia page I looked this up on, which don't trust Wikipedia because they get my stuff wrong anyway. At one point the page says 18,000 temples were destroyed, and in another point, like a paragraph on it, says 40,000 temples were destroyed. So I don't know who's editing Wikipedia these days. But anyway, a lot of temples were destroyed and things got crazy. So one of the things that the new government decided to do was to eliminate the Nikujiki Saitai laws. And let me read you what this says. They decided on eliminating all status privileges for the clergy, abolishing state enforcement of religious precepts, and dissolving many of the institutional arrangements that had governed relations between religious institutions and the state. And the Soto clergy in particular, probably other Japanese Buddhist clergies, did not like this because they had been trying for years to keep their various clergy following the rules. And the problem was these priests were marrying, not really marrying, but having basically wives and families and eating meat and doing all sorts of things anyway. And having these laws in place absolved the Soto, establishment from having to enforce them. So now they had to enforce them. And the like I say, the history is very convoluted and interesting, but it kind of goes through a lot of paths. The clergy objected to getting rid of these rules, and eventually they decided, okay, we're going to enforce these rules anyway, like the Catholic Church does over here within the church. But that didn't work because it was already kind of too late, and eventually sort of cooler heads prevailed, and by the 1930s the Soto clergy had accepted the fact that clerical marriage was going to be a thing, and there was nothing they could do about it. Basically, I'm shoving a lot of history into a very small package here. And in the 40s, with World War II on, this became even more important because temple families became very important to keeping the temples running while the husbands were off at war, basically. So by the time World War II was over, the whole thing was over, and basically clerical marriage in Japan was an established fact, and the Soto Shu decided to permit it. I guess the Nichiren Shu and the other Shus, the other different Buddhist sects in Japan, Jodo Shinshu, accepted as well. The stuff I read was particularly about Soto, but anyway, they all kind of accepted it, and that's what you got. So you have married clergy. This development, being uniquely Japanese, did not translate across the board around the world. As I said, that Taiwanese woman was really upset that I was becoming a Japanese monk, because in her view, Japanese monks were not real monks because of this, because they could get married, and because they could eat meat, and because they could grow their hair long, or whatever they wanted. There were no laws against it. And basically that's the way it is. It depends kind of on your teacher within the modern sort of contemporary Soto Shu. For example, my teacher Nishijima Roshi shaved his head all the time. But he didn't always do that, and I have pictures of him with hair, being a Buddhist priest. And his opinion was it didn't matter to him whether his monks shaved their heads. The reason I got my head shaved that one time is because it matters to the Soto Shu as the official organization, and I was getting ordained through them. But as soon as that ordination was over, I just grew my hair back because it didn't matter anymore. So that's kind of the way it plays out for these rules as it goes now. Now the question becomes, is this good or bad? Because now you just have to decide for yourself. As I say, some teachers require it, some teachers don't. Most teachers, I think, both here in the West and in Japan, would probably say to their students, you decide if you want to maintain celibacy and all of that. You figure it out. And that's kind of the way the precepts are approached too. I've done I did a whole video series on the precepts over, was it last summer? Anyway, fairly recently. You can go back and look at them. But the basic idea of the precepts is it's up to the individual to interpret them for herself or himself, and to decide how they want to follow them. For example, the rule against intoxicants. Most Japanese Buddhist priests from Japanese lineages that I know take a kind of like slightly iffy view on that one, and decide that the rule against intoxicants isn't across the board rule against intoxicants, it's a rule against abusing intoxicants. So they'll have a little bit of wine every now and then, or beer or whatever. That's the usual rule, and I decided for myself about a year ago that I was going to take that one really seriously. I mean, I'd always taken it pretty seriously, but I'd allowed myself lapses here and there, and I decided about a year ago, okay, no more lapses. I'm taking the intoxication rule completely, literally, and completely seriously. But that's my own standpoint on this. I don't make anybody I ordained do that. I don't tell you to do that out there. That's just my own standpoint on it. That's how I take it. As far as marriage goes, my Nishijima Roshi was married. My teacher Tim, my first teacher, wasn't married, but I knew that he had relationships here and there. Very sort of monogamous, long-term relationships, as far as I'm aware. But he had relationships. He didn't marry. His teacher, Kobenchino Otagawa Roshi, was married, I think a few times, I think 3 times, I'm not sure. Suzuki Roshi was married. Okumura Roshi, as I mentioned in the last video, is married, and there's a nice film about his family life on YouTube, so if you want to go look at it, I think it's called Sit. And The idea is, and I kind of said this last time, and there's not really much better way to say it than this, is that you sort of live a monk's life while living your home life too. So in my case, what does that mean? In my case, I sit zazen every damn day. My soon-to-be wife tolerates it. She doesn't usually join me. Sometimes she joins me, but not most of the time. I follow the rules the way I can, and I just live my life in this sort of milieu and accept that as being what I'm going to do. Would Dogen approve? I don't know. Dogen did not approve of his monks, his ordained monks, marrying or breaking the precepts in any way, but that was 800 years ago. I don't know, what he'd think about today. In fact, I would say as a Buddhist that Dogen was as much a part of his time and place as anything else, so you can't transport him out of that and say what would he think about today, because it's an irrelevant question. But I do know that the writings he left behind are very strict about this stuff. So if you want to take Dogen, as the letter of the law, then you couldn't get married, you'd have to be completely celibate, and so on and so forth. And he said you couldn't get enlightened unless you were. Now, on the other hand, he also said you could get enlightened if you weren't. So he vacillated on that point, depending on who he was talking to. Another thing I just finished that might be relevant, and I'll talk about this maybe one of these days, is the Vimalakirti Sutra. It's a famous sutra about a lay person whose name is Vimalakirti, who outshines all the monks and all the ordained people and is more enlightened than any of them. And it's kind of held up as the example of a lay person who was as fully enlightened as more enlightened than any ordained person. So that's another thing, and that goes back way, way before any of this, Nikujiki Saitai laws, and all this other stuff in the Meiji Restoration. This goes back like 1,000 years before that. So we have a long history of regarding lay people as being capable of being fully enlightened, and there you go. I tried to squeeze a lot into that. I hope you got some of it. If you want to donate to me being able to squeeze more things into videos, you can use the URL you're seeing right here. The website is being worked on, but right now these links that you're seeing on your screen do work, so go ahead and feel free to donate. It was never a problem that you were going to donate and it would go somewhere else. It was just a problem of getting the buttons to work, but now they work. So there you go. That's where you go. Remember, that is my only way of making a living. But if you don't have money, just forget about it. Don't support me. Support yourself. Take care of yourself. That's fine, because I'm hanging in there, and that's good. But I'm hanging in there because you people do donate. So we will see you later. Have a good time all the time. Bye. Hey, Ziggy. Did you enjoy the video? Yeah. Oh, he's wondering where my fiance's mom is, because she usually gives him a treat, but they're out doing their bachelorette trip right now. They'll be back in a little bit, Ziggy, don't worry. Hey Ziggy, show the people your face.